Hello, in this video, I want to talk a little bit about Derrida in general and talk a little bit about the last section of the videos, which will be how to answer affirmatives from Derrida. This has been a long series and I really enjoyed doing it as a whole because I think it was really interesting in order to talk about the ways in which hauntology, specters and marks, the ideas about deconstruction, and some of the other ideas that Derrida's just kind of had in general about the way in which we think about the role of debate, the way that it serves in its relationship to the university and the academy, I think have all just been really, really interesting conversations. And if you haven't, you should definitely check out at least the intro or some of the other videos that I've done talking about Derrida, because I think regardless of how you're kind of coming into contact with it, there's definitely a lot of things that you 100% need to learn in order to have context for what I'm talking about in this video. If you want to deal with Derrida affirmatives in terms of understanding some of the base concepts from the other videos, and also I think it can just be really helpful if you're thinking about what types of routes for the water resolution are people going to take, and what could be something helpful for you to look into to find maybe your own unique route and how you interact with the water resolution. And so I think just having track and keeping track of these videos as I've been doing them is really, really important, especially the video that I did right before this, the first video talking about how you should answer affirmatives about Derrida, because I think it's really good context in order for you to kind of understand some of the stuff that I'll be talking about in this video in order to continue finish off that conversation. In the last video, it was really important that we kind of talked about what I thought were some of the key places where I think contesting the kind of relationship that hauntology has to representation and affect is particularly important, but also the ability for you to kind of differentiate the types of critiques that you're making about affect and the representation to ones that really kind of flip the script on the stuff that I think hauntology is usually most comfortable in sitting in, and really turning into an argument about what it does politically as a set of tactics to kind of push the framework that I think teams are more comfortable with, considering some of the stuff that I talked about in the earlier videos about how to read this as an affirmative. And so I'm kind of going to use that in order to guide a lot of the advice that I give here when talking about criticisms, counterplans, and disads in this particular video. Just for thinking about how you should be reading criticisms generally, or what types of criticisms work against hauntology affirmatives or affirmatives about Derrida, I generally think that if teams are reading arguments about deconstruction or about hauntology, the way that you want to push your criticism is one to say that a lot of the arguments that Derrida is making are ones that are attempting to understand how various sources of violence and specters can be used as political tools in order to create a difference in the way that social and political institutions kind of manifest themselves, in the way in which we think about how they make those decisions, and how the methods that Derrida is kind of taking up can alter those kind of decision-making capacities, even if it means radical alteration to those institutions. And I think that you should just say that the idea that they can be kind of radically remade, or that there is a kind of possibility of accessing the kind of corrective to representation between text and meaning is really something where I think a lot of critiques can really place a lot of power in. I think that creating a thesis set of arguments, or linked arguments, that hauntology is meant to assume that the presentation of specters and the way that those specters are received by other people are something that the affirmative assumes that it has control over, when the way in which people just relate to the presence of the past as a cultural memory is much more complicated than they hear a thing, there is shock value there, as is this reaction, and they go on to create political action, that things a trauma, triggers, etc. all produce differential relationship to the presence of specters, especially for people that come from marginalized communities that are kind of the product of the accumulation of these historical violences. And I think that being able to talk about the way in which the affirmative only attempts to see one avenue for how representation kind of is able to be shown and taken in by people is a misrepresentation of the very complicated ways in which people relate themselves to just how they understand representation as a whole. But also to say that the idea that goods can be used, weaponized in one way, also assumes that the idea that coming from a particular type of community, a particular type of identity, means that there is ownership over who is able to present certain ghosts, etc. i.e. for instance, the way in which people can use the justification of certain specters in order to produce more desires towards capitalism, etc. And that the very existence of these things, even if they during their time existed as revolutionary, or we use for revolutionary reasons, the kind of argument that Derrida is making about the kind of slippage between text and meaning can be very, very much imported onto the very way in which the 1AC assumes that there's just kind of one-on-one relationship between the presentation of specters and the way in which we kind of form ourselves politically. And I think being able to move on that offensively and really win not only presumption level claims in terms of how that stops the affirmative from producing a clean way to oriented solvency, but also as a way for you to think about the kind of like iconography of like how we think about specters and the types of specters that get chosen in order to like highlight particular forms of violence can be like really, really interesting in order to like open up how the very idea of like what counts or like what registers as a specter is already something that is gendered, is kind of like sexualized, is racialized, etc., and is meant to like produce certain means for how people react in a relationship to like how that's already entrenched in like violent forms of like colonial memory, etc. And so I think that there are like a really interesting ways to kind of like flip a lot of the way in which the team kind of want to weigh their arguments against them and use it in a way that allows you to kind of like frame the debate and push like a lot of like pressure on the method portion of the affirmative to be able to explain like how ontology deals with like a differential relationships to how like specters constitute themselves, and like what it means like for a specter to be recognized, what types of specters to be recognized, and a little bit just more of these kind of like complicated questions I think the criticism really pushes and imposes on them that I think are just generally strategic. And then when you're kind of like moving into like what I think about maybe some of the stuff that we talked about in the context of counterplans and disads, I really think that it's really interesting to have a conversation of what this looks like, because kind of like I said before, there are definitely two routes in which you can go for counterplans and disads against like these types of affirmatives, which is the one route where you're kind of going the way of like attempting to prove that there is a viability of understanding the relationship specters have, so like how we produce politics, and trying to win it like the counterplan and the disad serve as examples of like how like policy can take in the context specters. And I think that when you're trying to take it from that perspective, is really just a question of how you can win about like a question of scale, and that the kind of political response that the affirmative has of a ontology in general doesn't allow us to like do anything than go beyond affect, and the only way to kind of like make ontology effective is really to put it within the confines of specific political demands, because of kind of all the slippages of representation that we've talked about throughout like other portions of the video. And I think on that route you can really subsume a lot of the offense that the affirmative wants to go for in terms of like how you kind of like toss away the memory of ghosts, and really just force the debate into being a question of like, once we have already accepted like the presence of these specters, what type of like political methodology should we take up, and what type of particular like political demands are really important. And I think in that sense the counterplan dissat can really contest with some of like the portions of the ontology affirmative that I think that the affirmative is a little bit less comfortable in terms of sitting inside of in general. And then I think that when you're trying to think about this in the context of like how this relates to the other side of the strategy, which looks a little bit more like maybe like impact turning this and making arguments about like why, regardless of the failures of the past, there has to be a way in which we kind of like conform ourselves to the way in which the system is kind of like already too far gone, especially in the context of things like environmental degradation, etc., and just making arguments about things why, for instance, like capitalism, neoliberalism, etc., are necessary for like the sustainability of the environment and things like that. I think could be a really interesting set of arguments to go along in order to just like completely go really on the offensive, in order to be like with the case arguments that are kind of like already winning on the process of like how there's this kind of like slippage between like how the specters are being represented and how people take and receive them, and the ability to think about that in relationship to like how this kind of like political machine, or like how these institutions operate, as something that's just like more effective and precise than the methodology of the affirmative, and could be, depending on how you do the impact framing portion of the debate in relationship to some of the stuff that we've talked about in other videos and talking about impact comparison, could mean that you're like really leaning the places where a judge is evaluating that like methodology debate a lot more in your terms, where I think overall could just be like really, really helpful. Hopefully this video can be helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into some of the other videos that I'll be doing just in general, because I really enjoy doing this particular series on Derrida. And yeah, hopefully I'll be able to revisit it, or you will be able to too, in order to guide some of the questions that you have for the resolution and moving forward. Thanks.